gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the first lecture in our Renaissance series. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm one of the directors here at the BLSI and one of the organizers of this particular theme. This is actually something quite special for us because the Renaissance, Journeys of Discovery, is a set of about 36 talks ranging from September 25 to June 2026, covering all sorts of aspects. You think the Renaissance is easy to pin down. It's only easy to pin down if you're Italian, because then you have a very definitive time slot and very definitive genres that you'd be talking about. But in our case, the Renaissance spans 3 centuries. In our theme, it starts in 1350 or thereabouts and finishes in about 1650. And the last talk we're going to have is actually on Thomas Hobbes and his book, The Leviathan, which was actually published in 1651. So we had to stretch it to 1651 from 1650 to get him in. And that's a talk in May. But what is also very difficult about the Renaissance, it wasn't actually just something that happened in Europe, it happened everywhere. And the influences of the Renaissance in terms of the New World, but also the East, will be discussed as part of the theme. And we're also going to be looking at lots of different subjects. We're looking at astronomy, we're looking at art, we're looking at astronomy, we're looking at politics, philosophy, we're even looking at psychology, geography, etc. So there's a huge amount of diversity in this particular theme. And I would encourage you all to make as many talks as possible. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Adalgisa to introduce Carlotta, our speaker. Adalgisa.
Thank you, Andreas. Good evening, everybody. I am a part of the Italian group, and that's why I am introducing Carlotta tonight. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Carlotta Paltrinieri, one of the leading researchers in Renaissance studies. Dr. Paltrinieri graduated initially at the University of Bologna and then went to Indiana University, Bloomington, to do an MA and her PhD, specializing in early modern literature and art history. She now lectures at the University of Royal Holloway, or Royal Holloway College, University of London. But before joining Royal Holloway, she worked on quite a large number of projects. One of them at the Medici Archive project, and held research fellowships in Ireland, in Rome, and London. Carlotta's research interests lie at the intersection of intellectual and social history and artistic literature. Her most recent publications focus on the sociological analysis of art academies and the study of the rhetoric of early modern newsletters. She's also interested in digital approaches to the study of art history, intellectual history, and literature, and has focused in particular on the usefulness of digital humanities for the study of early modern sources. She's currently working on a digital edition of a manuscript held at the Central National Library of Florence. Tonight, Carlotta is going to tell us about her research on Renaissance academies and their role in society. She will tell us how her work on previously understudied archival collections has enabled her to explore a larger number of academies and to move from Italian academies to European ones. She sets these academies within the context from which they emerged. So looking at the intellectual and political and social environments in which they were born, but also moving on to look at the impact that these academies had on these contexts. So in turn, going back between the context and then back to the context. So I look forward to this fascinating journey that Dr. Paltrinieri is taking us on tonight, and to look at the revolution that these academies operated on the intellectual landscape of Europe. And over to you, Carlotta. I think we stay.
Thank you. Okay, Adalgisa for this. All right. After this introduction is probably going to be a disappointment, this presentation, so hopefully not too much. All right, so before I start, I'd like to thank Adalgisa and Andreas so much, and everyone in the room and everyone online for being here. I'm extremely happy to open this series, and hopefully, again, it won't be a disappointment to be the opening act. So we're to stick with the title of the presentation today. Our journey together will lead us through not only an understanding of academies as places of discovery, but also through a rediscovery of the role and meaning of archives, both in the Renaissance period and in our own society. So let's start our journey, and hopefully it will be a 42-minute journey and not longer than that. Is it working? No. Okay. Aha, it works now. I spoiled it. Okay. So, Renaissance discovery, I'm going to use air quotes, and you're going to understand why in a little bit, as we understand them today, derive from a more general thirst for knowledge that pushed the boundaries of the known in many directions, starting from the places where knowledge was generated, disseminated, and questioned. The traditional places of learning, so the university, the workshop, the guild, the church, could no longer satisfy the Renaissance thirst for knowledge. Their physical and intellectual walls could no longer hold against the new waves of conceiving the known and the unknown. This quest for discovery, the thirst for knowledge, and this need for new places and spaces of learning were part of a much broader cultural and intellectual phenomenon defined by scholars as humanesimo, humanism. While the wider scholarly understanding of humanism is that of a period of renewed interest in the human existence and experience, what is crucial for us today is to explore the practical implications of this phenomenon for the development of the studia humanitatis, or humanities, so the disciplines worthy of the learned men and women of the Renaissance. So these humanists conceptualized, developed, and fought for a pedagogical revolution, a change of the school system that matched a gradual broadening of the profile of the ideal learner. And it is in the Renaissance that the artists, for example, are seen for the first time as learners as well. And also the expansion of the medieval curriculum through the inclusion of disciplines that were not previously considered suitable for the ennobled mind, among which the arts. So it is specifically within this humanistic pedagogical revolution, also rooted in the rediscovery of classical texts and languages, so Latin, Greek, but also Arabic, that I would like to frame the ideation and creation of Renaissance academies, model themselves after the classical academies. Let's think, for instance, about the academy founded by Plato, to educate future politicians through the teaching of philosophy and rhetoric. So I wish we had something like that today as well, because clearly our politicians could use some philosophy and rhetoric. The Accademia, both in ancient Greece and in the Renaissance, was also a place for erudite discussions, among scholars of different backgrounds and disciplines, which made them the perfect forum for developing new ways of learning and new avenues for intellectual discovery. It is not by chance that one of the first academies to be revived in the Renaissance was the Accademia Neoplatonica, the Neoplatonic Academy, led by the humanist Marsilio Ficino under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, the kind of, no, I don't want to say ugly, but not the prettiest person on this slide. And we could not embark on this journey of discovery of Florentine academies without mentioning the Medici family. The Medici that ruled Florence for about 300 years between the 15th and the 18th centuries. Culture and specifically arts and literature were seen by the Medici as instrumental for the success of their dynasty. Perhaps the most strategic of the Medici in weaponizing Florentine cultural products and institution is Cosimo I de' Medici. This instrumentalization has been defined as cultural politics. So it is within this cultural politics that we should situate the creation of three main Medici academies. Accademia Fiorentina, which was the literary academy, Accademia del Disegno, the art academy, and Accademia della Crusca, the language academy. So these academies were both places of learning and erudite discussions and pawns for the advancement of Cosimo I's cultural politics, at times blurring the lines between humanistic ideals and political propaganda. Even though the economic patronage of the Medici dictated the contents and production of these academies, our journey of discovery will show us that they still managed to perform an educational and social function, at times even at odds with the court mandates. And the focus of the talk today and our case studies will be the Accademia del Disegno, so the first art academy of the Western world. So we're always speaking from our biased point of view, but it is the first art academy. So I don't know how many of you have been to Florence before, but if you want to see the places that represent the Accademia del Disegno, you will have to walk in the Piazza Santissima Annunziata, which is this piazza, in which you have two buildings, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Innocent Hospital, and Basilica de Santissima Annunziata, okay? Why are these buildings particularly important for the Accademia? If you go and walk across the portico, and I know that you tend to look down because there's dog, things around, but if you look up, there are frescoes. It's a cycle of fresco by Bernardo Puccetti, and it is a celebration of Cosimo I's achievements, among which the creation of the Art Academy. And you know that we're talking about that because you see in the top corner the three wreaths that are the symbol of the Academy. And this person kneeling down is Vincenzo Borghini, who was the director of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, but also one of the most loyal functionaries of Cosimo I. So Vincenzo Borghini is kneeling and giving Cosimo sort of the statutes of the Academy. And then, if you turn around, you see the Basilica della Santissima Annunziata, and inside the Basilica, the Chapel of the Artists. And this signals the fact the Accademia was not just a place for education, it was also a social place for artists. So all the burials and the funerals of artists were undertaken by the Academy, and they were buried in this chapel. And if you walk into the chapel, which was just now restored, there is a big fresco in the middle, and it's Giorgio Vasari, who is very humbly portraying the Virgin Mary that appeared to him. And Giorgio Vasari is one of the founders of the Academy, as well as a very famous architect and writer of the lives of the artists. So let's say that if you walk around this piazza, your main understanding is that these three men are the pillars of the foundation and the success of the Academy, which is true to an extent. You wouldn't be wrong to think that they are the three founders. That is also what contemporary official accounts would tell you. Scholars and academic books would also confirm this, and they would provide quite a neat definition of the functions and of the activities of the Academy, all of which would be factually correct. So I'm not telling that my fellow scholars are wrong. So if you study the official court records talking about the Academy, you would know these main facts: that it was the first art academy ever founded for artists, that it used to be a guild, and then it was institutionalized into an academy. So together with practical knowledge, they integrated theoretical knowledge, so they were also teaching theory. It was supported by the Medici financially, although, I mean, that's what they said, but then you read the documents and they're always asking for more money, and the Medici are like, you're not that important. So yes, they were supported to an extent. They were divided. So we always talk about the artists in the academy, but within the academy, there was a big division between craftsmen and academicians. So there still was a big division inside. It had very different functions through the years, and it was suppressed in 1784 at the end of the Medici dynasty. We do have an Accademia del Disegno in Florence today, and if you look on their website, they claim to be the Renaissance Academy. They're not. They were magically revived under the Mussolini era, but they don't say that on the website. They say that they are the Renaissance Academy. They are not. But anyway, let's not go there. Let's move on. So both archival records and historians agreed, for example, on this timeline and on the ever-shifting nature of the academy, from a guild in the 14th century to an academy, to a university, to a magistrature. So all the matters, the legal matters around art commissions were dealt within the academy. So I'm not disputing any of the facts that we know from the official records. Most of our knowledge of the academy comes from its own statutes, held today at the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale di Firenze. So these statutes, which are quite long, mainly define the academy as the Academy of the Arts of Design. So sculpture, painting, and architecture. They tell us that they existed since the times of Giotto. This is a lie. There was no academy at the time of Giotto, but they had to come up with a narrative for their own story. They proclaim Saint Luke as the patron saint of the Academy of all the artists. So they had this very strong religious dimension as well. They declare Cosimo I as the prince and Michelangelo Buonarroti as the other prince of the academy. So we're still believing everything that they say at this point. And then they say they're open to Florentines first, but also forestieri and stranieri, which in English is both foreigners, but there is a distinction. In the Renaissance, Italy wasn't a united nation. So forestieri were the foreigners from the peninsula, but outside of Tuscany, so a Sicilian, a Neapolitan, and stranieri would be from outside of the Italian peninsula, so Germans, French, etc. So everyone was welcome, in theory. Then we'll see how that's not the case. So in this journey, I like to show you that we need to be careful with our sources of information, even the official ones, and not to forget that historical records, especially the official ones, respond to and are a product of a very complex socio-political context. For instance, if we believe the statutes that you just saw, written by the founders, no questions asked, we would understand Michelangelo Buonarroti as to be an integral part in the making and success of the academy. They call him the prince. They say, oh, he's going to lead us because he's the greatest artist ever existed. We would not be compelled to question or to doubt the theatrical and quite unmissable visual association between the bust of Michelangelo and the symbols of the Academy once again. So you go, and it's the tomb of Michelangelo. So you walk up to it, and you see, oh, Michelangelo and the Academy. Of course, they were one thing. And the tomb is designed by Giorgio Vasari, who is the founder of the Academy. So we start to see some patterns here. Little would we know that Michelangelo never agreed to be part of the Academy. He never agreed to work again for the Medici. It definitely never agreed to return to Florence. So his body that is buried here was stolen from Rome by his nephew and brought back to Florence. But if you walk up to the tomb, you will only know that Michelangelo, the greatest Florentine artist, was part of the Academy. Okay? So if we read the documents produced by the Medici court or written for the Medici, we would only know of the greatness of the Academy and its central role, not only for the Medici and their court artists, but also for the world. So the Academy was indeed commissioned very big ceremonies, for example. So for the funeral of Benedetto Varchi, who was a very important philosopher, the Academy was commissioned, the apparato and the tomb. For the marriage of the son of Cosimo I and the Queen of Austria, they were in charge of providing the whole celebrations. They were also asked to commission a drawing to build the Escorial Palace in Madrid. So I'm not underplaying their importance. They were definitely a very important academy. And this is the drawing that they sent to Madrid to build the Escorial. However, our journey of discovery today poses the question, what happens if, for a moment, we set aside the Medici propaganda and the court documentation and we rediscover the archives of the Academy itself? This has been the research question underpinning my own work for the past 7 years, which led me to revisit and reconsider the collections held in 4 major archives and libraries, which are here. The ugliest building in Florence is the State Archive, okay? You cannot miss it. Among the beautiful Renaissance palaces, there you go, okay? So, these collections hold documents pertaining to the everyday activities of the Academy and its members, regulations, letters, contracts, lessons, minutes of meetings, finances, most of which are held in the Florentine State Archive. And again, in case you missed it, this is it. So how do you start? Where do you go? How do you start a research on the archive of the Academy? So you walk into this very nice building and you get to the reception with very grumpy archivists. Do you have a card? Of course, everything in Italian. They'll pretend not to understand you if you don't speak Italian. Finally, you manage to go across, you manage to get your card, and you get to the study room, which I'm not sure who thought about the lighting. It's not great. There's no air conditioning, there is no heating, so you're always working under the condition of the weather outside, and they're holding manuscripts of centuries old, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, so this is what it looks like, and then in that tiny room right there is the inventory room. So it's the room with the inventories of all of the collections, so you would start from there. And this is a picture of the inventory that I should have not taken because it's not allowed, and which you're listed everything that is part of the collection. So what I did in a very academic way was to transcribe the inventory, which is of about 158 volumes for my own use, but also to share with other scholars, in which you have the titles of every volume and the period in which it was produced, just to give you a sense of the amount of things that there are in this archive. Okay, that's enough. I'm going to give you a few examples of the kind of documents you find in the archive. A lot of letters exchanged between the head of the Academy, so the director, the first director was Vincenzo Borghini, that was telling the Duke of Florence, Cosimo I, everything that was happening in the Academy. So at the beginning, Vincenzo Borghini, or what was called the lieutenant, was the official informant of the court. It was sort of a spy telling what was happening in the Academy, because the Medici, despite saying that they were the sort of supporter of the Academy, never set foot in the Academy. So they had the lieutenant working for them. This is one of the letters that Borghini sends to Cosimo I, and it says, "Umilissimo suo, yours humbly, Vincenzo Borghini." This is an example of a volume of ricordi, which is of records, of memories. So everything that happened in the Academy was recorded in these volumes. And this is a little bit what it looks like. So throughout this gallery of pictures, you will see how many times the archive changed policies around how to handle documents. So first we had to use plastic gloves. You can see there. Then you'll see how my hand changes over time. This is an example of a volume of deliberazioni, so decisions made in the Academy. And this is an example of how it's written. So you would have at the top the day in which they met and what happened. So in this particular instance, they met, and these 4 people, actually 3 people, were elected to a role within the Academy, the role of consigliere. And they say that they're going to, do everything that the Duke tells them to do, etc., except the Duke didn't really care about the Academy that much. So there was, I don't want to say complete chaos, but there was a little bit of rebellion within the Academy. For example, this is a plea, a supplica, sent to the Duke. Now, there was a very strict hierarchy within the Academy. So you had the artists, then you had the chancellor, then you had the consigliere, then you had the lieutenant, and then the Medici. So like today in a corporation, you wouldn't go to the boss to complain. You would complain to your line manager, that would complain to their line manager, that would complain all the way to the top. These 6 artists decided that they were fed up with their line manager. So they wrote directly to the Duke of Florence, saying, there's some corruption here, the wrong people are being appointed, the elections were rigged, blah, 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 blah. If you read the names of these artists, you wouldn't recognize them. And this probably tells you that this plea didn't really go well. So they were cast away from the Academy, and they were just forgotten. That's how merciful the Medici were with the people that didn't follow the rules. So here is an abstract in which they're saying that they're complaining about the fact that someone, Jacopo del Zucca, was elected as academician, but he wasn't of age yet. He should have been 16, he wasn't yet 16. And then, if you know a little bit about Florentine painters of the time, Zucca is the name of one of the court painters of the Medici. So his son got elected in the Academy. So nothing changed. Italian politics are the same today. So we did not change in many years. This is an example of what is called the vacchetta, so a small volume of squittini. Squittini is elections. And this is actually where the most important and interesting stuff is. So this is a list of everyone that was elected or entered the Academy. And this is where I found the most surprising names that proved once again that the Academy was not just a place for artists, it was a place for scientists, it was a place for poets, for philosophers that would meet in the Academy because they understood the value of learning arts despite not practicing them, okay? And then I brought to you another volume, which is a volume that lists all the membership fees. So they have to pay a fee to become academicians. And there are quite a few of them. There are about 60 volumes of membership fees. And this is what they look like. So you have the name of the person that entered, and these lines on the right are actually the amount that they paid in the month that they paid it. And this is one of the I guess, earliest records. And right up on top, you might read Leonardo di Signor Piero da Vinci. So this is the record of Da Vinci entering the Academy. And next to it, the initials are the months that he paid to be in the Academy. A little bit later on, in 1616, so quite almost a century later, we have another important entrance to the Academy, Madonna Artemisia di Orazio Lomi Pittrice, which is Artemisia Gentileschi, who is the first woman to enter the Academy in 1616. Now, I'm very happy that a woman was finally allowed. Well, technically, by the statutes, women could always join the Academy. But the Academy was created in 1563, and the first one to enter is 1616. So you see how they were quite slow in implementing their own regulations. And yes, it's true that it's a female painter, so it's very important, but also we have to keep in mind the social element. So she was the daughter of a very influential painter. They came from quite a wealthy family. So yes, she's a female painter, but at the same time, it underscores that it was always the wealthy academicians that managed to succeed. And then a little bit later, this is 1647, you might see another name that you might recognize right here. Is Galileo Galilei, who also enters the Academy. And why is Galileo entering the Academy? Again, the Academy was an attractive institution to be in because you could meet people that were influential, but also Galileo was someone that was appointed as a lettore, as a lecturer of mathematics in the Academy. So they were teaching mathematics and geometry to the painters. He was one of the teachers for the Academy, and this is where he met most of the artists that became his lifelong friends. So you cannot see what's in the labels, but believe me, they are names of artists that, of members of the Academy. What I've been trying to do here was to underscore the fact that the people in the Academy were not just artists. So I'm trying to show that this Academy is not only interesting and valuable for art historians, but for anyone that is interested in understanding the networks of power in Florence. So for example, the role of the lieutenant, the number one rule was that the lieutenant couldn't be an artist. They had to be a non-professional of the arts because they had to be above whatever disputes the artist could have, but also because they were supposed to be functionaries of the Medici court. The more we go into the history of the Accademia, the more this changes. So at the beginning, we only see the names of very loyal functionaries of the Medici, names that you would expect of families that are loyal to the Medici family. And gradually, we see that these names change. And we also have people that openly oppose the Medici family that became the head of the Academy. And this is quite significant to understand the dynamics of and the power of an academy. So drawing connections among the members reveals that the Academy was much more than a place of learning or an instrument of propaganda. The discovery of the archives of the Accademia del Disegno allows scholars and everyone else, because it's a public archive, so you can all go. Although historians really want you to think that you cannot access, it's just for specialists. You can just walk. I mean, if you can go past the grumpy archivists, you can study yourselves. So it's helpful to reconsider the inner workings and to draw a much more complex picture than the one painted by its founders. So how did I get to study the Academy? Because as a PhD student, I was working on the art theory and how art theories developed over time. And in the Renaissance, there was this idea to empower artists to become intellectuals, because before the Renaissance, artists were considered practitioners, so not worthy of having a humanistic education. In the Renaissance, we start to see a shift in the way the artists are seen. So the Academy should be, at least theoretically, the place in which they are allowed to learn, because they couldn't attend universities. So they had to find their own place for learning. So technically, the Academy was supposed to be that place. So as a PhD student working from the United States, it was not super easy to go back and forth from Florence. So I just trusted my fellow historians when they said, the Academy is the place where artists learned. Like, yes, great. So it just proves my point that there is, a gradual improvement of the condition of the artist in the Renaissance. And I finished my dissertation. I go to Florence to see these records myself, and I don't find them. So in the 158 documents of 300 years of the Academy, there's only a mention to 2 lessons given in the Academy. The rest of it is a lot of social networks, a lot of this person came, this person left, why is this? A lot of financial records, a lot of economics that I knew nothing about. I realized how ignorant I am on, finances. And I had to learn a little bit of economic history to understand that it was not just a place for theory and for learning. So such rediscovery and questioning of archival sources underpin not only my own research, but the work of a group of scholars led by a professor at the University of Siena. And this group of scholars are rediscovering the archives to trying to rethink of this academy. So we were thinking before this work, we thought that Florence had about 3 official academies and about a handful of unofficial, so sort of rebellious academies. And after this work that we've done, turns out we have over 170 academies just in Florence, just in the 16th and 17th century. So this is the first volume that we put together it's just a list of all of the academies that we found in the archives and some sort of indication where to find the resources for that. And now they're working on a second volume on Siena, which was also part of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. There's also a talk in this series by Lisa Sampson in February, I think. She will talk about the theatrical academy. So these academies were, again, for literature, for language, for art, for theater, and for science. So there were scientific academies as well. So I invite you to come to Lisa's talk. So the archives of Renaissance academies remind us that these institutions stood at a crossroads of knowledge, power, and networks, born out of a society eager for discovery and learning. Yet, as much as they shed a light on the intellectual curiosity and momentum of the time, they also force us to reflect on what archives really are. They're not neutral repositories of facts, but places shaped by privilege, by omissions, and by biases. So the voices we hear most clearly are of those that held power, while many others remain absent or even silenced. This tension should make us pause for a second when we speak of discoveries, whether in the Renaissance or today, for often what is hailed as a breakthrough or an innovation, it is in truth not a discovery at all, but rather a rediscovery through the lens of a particular culture, most often the Western world. So we didn't discover America. It was already there, for example. If we are to take seriously the theme of this series, so the journey of discovery, then our journey must also include a reckoning with what is missing, the duty to acknowledge the oppressed, the marginalized, to question the record that we inherit, and to be mindful of traces we ourselves leave behind. For in the end, every archive can tell us as much about those it excludes as about those it preserves. So thank you for coming on this journey with me, and I was so quick. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlotta, for a very interesting talk, cramming in lots of history, lots of politics, lots of intrigue, lots of artists, And it's a really fascinating discussion around what the Renaissance academies actually documented. And even in those centuries, that the narrative is obviously won by those who are in privileged positions, have wealth, etc. So actually probing that and actually finding something that isn't what it pretends to be, and actually delving underneath the sort of old adage that history is written by the victor, and actually finding out what is actually missed out, must have been a fascinating experience for you. And I think, given that you covered things like the Medicis and Michelangelo and Galileo Galilei, there must be lots of questions in the room and probably also online. So I'm going to throw it open to the audience in the room first for a question. Who would like to ask the first question? Nobody just yet? Oh, there's a gentleman. I was waiting for him. He was dithering. There we go.
Well, I've spent 50 years working in Italian archives, and I sympathize with your description of the lack of lighting, the little room you're stuck in, etc., etc. You didn't mention the opening hours and so on, and how many documents you're allowed per day, which is, so I know Florence as well as Friuli, as well as Milano, and they're all fascinating. So, yeah, I'm going to switch tack from that, just to say I share your pain. I wondered about Medici and Florence under Cosimo. Of course, another important figure at the period was Eleonora of Toledo and the Jesuits and the seminary that's founded in Florence. How far did that impact on the academy?
Good question. So there was, of course, a lot of exchange between the places of learning in Florence. So definitely the Jesuits were a big influence, and then we have to keep in mind also the whole censorship coming from the church as well. Eleonora is also one of those figures that we tend to associate with Cosimo, is the wife, but actually she was a very strong diplomat. She had her own interest, and that comes very strongly out of the records of the Academy. She was the one commissioning things. She was the one dealing with the painters that were sometimes rebellious. And there were Jesuits in the Academy as well. We don't know exactly if they joined the Academy to keep an eye on what was happening, or if they were truly invested in the learning phase. Again, unfortunately, there are not a lot of documents attesting to what they were learning, other than there was anatomy, there was mathematics, there were pictorial theories, but we don't know exactly how much input from the outside, from the non-artist, was given in terms of the learning. For example, the Adalgisa earlier mentioned an edition that I'm working on, which is a manuscript that I want to say I discovered. I did not discover. It was cataloged, so someone already knew about it. It's a lesson that was miscatalogued. So it's cataloged as lezione di pittura, so lesson on painting. But if you actually read it, it's a lesson on the theory of humors. So it's a medical treatise that was presented at the Academy. We don't know the author, we don't know the date, so it was very fun to try and do the edition of this. So I'm trying to guess that it was something that was produced but at the time that Galileo was in the Academy. It's the kind of discussion that he would be interested in. All of this to say that there were exchanges with the Jesuits, and because of the Jesuits' big influence, I'm never sure if their presence means a true interest or just a monitoring or a sort of a way to shape the conversation. But unfortunately, the records of the Academy do not tell us that. But we would look into the correspondence, for example, and the court documents. Again, you see the biases of the court documents, so it's a little bit unclear. So the answer, very short, not sure. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question.
Yeah.
What was the relationship like between the sort of emerging humanism
Mm-hmm.
in the Renaissance and the church? And also, what was the catalyst for the establishment of the academies in the first place? What was the real underlying reason?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first question. So the humanism did this thing that the church had to grapple with, which was to revive the pagan values and mythology and everything that had to do with non-Christianity or not monotheism. But they made it spin in a way that was persuasive. So everything was an allegory for Christian values. So all of the paganism, all of the myths are actually an allegory for Christian values. So the church sort of, even all of the nudity that you go to the Vatican, it's a lot of naked bodies. Think, how does that, compute? But it's because they were allegories of something else. So that is humanism, because it was an intellectual movement that upheld Christian values through the use of classical text, was something that was accepted. And as far as the academies, I can only speak for the Florentine ones. So the three that I've identified, the catalyst was Cosimo I understanding the value of manipulating such institutions. So he understood that it's a little bit like today. The political propaganda can happen through cultural channels. So literature, if all the literary production of Florence has to go through the Academy, there's a very big control over it. So they had also a Medici press. So the press, of course, only printed what the Medici wanted, and that was also part of shaping the canon. The language academy, they called it the language academy, but it was the Florentine language more than we didn't have an Italian language, so it was another way of situating Florence as the city in Italy, and as well the art academy. So no artist could produce artworks in Florence unless they were members of the academy. So that was another way of shaping the culture. So I don't know if that's...
Thank you. I wonder how independent today's academies really are. So, for another day. Right. Oh, there's a gentleman here at the back. Give me a second, I'll just go past the back. If you speak directly.
So you mentioned Artemisia Gentileschi in 1616. Were many more women after that point admitted?
No, not at that point, and not for a long time. So she was sort of an exception for her time. Later on in the 17th century, you'll see more, so she paves the way for other artists. But it's only, I would say, the latest years of the Academy that you see a constant presence of female artists. And I feel like they also have different channels through which they have. So Artemisia operated a lot outside of Italy as well. She was in England as well. So I think they went through the more usual routes for patronage. So they identified courts that they would want to work with them, and they would be referred. So there was a big network of referrals. So for example, we have a letter that the Medici sent to the governor of Milan at the time, introducing Leonardo da Vinci and try to sort of say, oh, he's a nice artist, you should have them. And so it's like listing, it's like a curriculum that they sent to, so they work through a network of patrons more than the academies, I would say. But the poets were a little bit more advanced in this sense. They were a little bit more inclusive. So since the 16th century, literary academies have a lot more female poets than we have female artists, for example. So there is in Siena one academy that is of female-only poets already in the end of the 16th century. I'm sure that Lisa Samson will also talk about that. The artists were not the most inclusive community at the time. But I mean, there were some defense towards female artists, but then in practice, there was not. There was a lot of talk and a lot of women are equal. They're great as well. They have amazing feelings that they channel through their art. But then in practice, there's not a lot of emancipation in this period. Yeah.
Too many male egos.
if you read the documents, it's just, they go on and on about, I thought that was my commission. You said that was my commission. Yes,
Okay, plenty more questions. Okay, could you just pass that?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Following on from that, you said about foreigners technically being able to enter the academies. How often did that happen? Was that something that they kind of actually did, or was that just something that they said in their in their founding document?
Yes. Well, it's again a matter of popularity. It was a popularity contest. So if there was some artist that was very big outside of Florence, then having them in the academy was a mark of prestige. So you would have Titian, you would have Flemish painters that were, popular at the time because they would bring prestige to Florence. But otherwise, the not so famous ones, you don't see that many. I would say, it's always an increasing number through the years, so it looks like there is a little bit of an opening, but also it was more usual towards the end of the 16th and 17th century. There is a little pre-grand tour happening of the artists coming to Florence, but in that case, it was just an instrumentalization of their presence to show, you see how Florence is great? Everybody wants to be part of the academy. But everybody paid a fee, so it was quite, interesting for them to have people signing up for the academy. It was quite a hefty fee as well. So, and foreigners paid more than local artists to enter the academy. So there are. I wouldn't say at the beginning. I feel they say that they're very open and inclusive, and they're not. But towards the mid history of the academy, I would say it's more frequent. But it's kind of very easy to pinpoint because they, of course, Italianized the name, but then in parentheses they're like the French, like the Flemish. So they really want to show that they were not Florentine. But even the Romans and Neapolitans are sort of treated the same way. They're like in Napoletano, so to make sure that it's not a Tuscan artist. But yeah, they fight about commissions as well, the poor foreigners.
Okay, any more questions in the room? Lady at the front, yes.
Carlotta, thank you very much. This was really very interesting. My question is very basic. What would these people actually obtain in exchange for paying their fees and being members? And what would the fact that they would advertise themselves as having Michelangelo as one of their members actually mean for the academy in terms of how did they attract the people? Simply because Michelangelo was a member? What would they get back from there? And why would Michelangelo not want to be associated?
So the first question, what do they obtain? Again, it was more that you had, just like a corporation, so before the academy, you had to be part of that to be commissioned to practice. So that was one of the main reasons. It was also a way to work with big names. To be part of the academy, you got to work, because before the academy, you had the workshop system. So you had to be in the workshop of Verrocchio, in the workshop of this. In the academy, it was more, technically more open. Then there were divisions as well, but you get to work with big artists that are in the academy. Even if marginally, your name will appear next to theirs. So that was a marker of success in a way. Same thing for Michelangelo. That is a much broader operation the Medici tried to do. So the Michelangelo was the artist at the time. So just having his name near anything would bring prestige and money, especially. Michelangelo was seen as the symbol of Florence. So they always tried to involve him in a way. So Michelangelo breaks his ties with Florence a long time before going to Rome. So he goes to Rome to work for the Pope. And when you're commissioned by the Pope, you made it as an artist because it was the most powerful commission. So the papal patronage was more prestigious than the Medici patronage, although it was equally important. So Michelangelo was working for the Pope. He had no interest in going back to Florence. Also, he saw the Medici as people that took power that didn't belong to them, so illegitimate family of Florence. So he didn't, and Cosimo himself, so the Grand Duke himself would write letters to Michelangelo, he wouldn't even reply. And that's when you know that an artist made it, if you can afford not to reply to the Grand Duke of Florence. But he had some, sort of conflicting relationship with the Pope as well. It was not all friends and love, but he didn't want to be associated with Florence anymore at any point. But the Florentines didn't care that much, and they just waited for him to die and just brought them back to Florence. And now, if you think of Michelangelo, you think of Florence, you don't think of Rome, but most of his big work was for Rome and for the Roman. So Vasari made it in the end. We still talk about the Academy with Michelangelo and Florence as one thing, despite not being the reality of the time.
So what do the academics in Florence say about your research of disowning Michelangelo from Florence and putting him back into Rome?
Did you talk to them? Because I feel like, no, I had a little bit of I don't know if you can tell, I'm not someone that is very diplomatic in the way that I express myself. So I was invited to, in Italy, when you're working on a topic, everybody will know in a minute. This person is working on this topic. So when I started working on the Accademia del Disegno, which is one of the themes that are considered done and studied, like Dante. Why would you study Dante? Everything has been said. So they heard of this person in the United States working on the Accademia, like, oh, wow, what else is to say? So, keep your enemies closer. They invited me to Florence to give a talk at the Academy. That's what I did. Yeah, there you go, same thing, it didn't change. So I just said, you claim to be the Academy, but you're not. Ha! And so that didn't go very well. And they said, no, but we have the archive. You shouldn't have it. So the post-Medici archive is in the current Accademia del Disegno for some, I don't know if they knew the mayor of Florence then, anyway, so they have the other part of the archive, which should be public, but they claim it's theirs, but it's still a state archive, so anyway. So I sort of said that they shouldn't keep it for them, it's not for them to keep, and they also should be more transparent, that they're not that academy, they are some inspired by the academy, maybe. So no, that's what they say, that I've been told that I'm not a real scholar, that I don't know how to interpret the archive, and because they have their own archivist that is someone that hasn't set foot in the historical archive for like 20 years. Because you can see, another great thing, you can see who was at the archive that day. So another thing that I did was to see when this person was last at the archive, not in a long time. So we had a whole debate so they created a database it was a great effort, I think, with all the names of all the members of the Academy throughout the years, which would be a great tool, because you can just type the name and it will tell you where to find it in the archives, quite great, except for the fact that they had interns entering the data and that they didn't check. So most of the information on the website is not correct. And so I also said that to them, and that also wasn't really appreciated. But so if you want to work in Italy, do not follow my example, because I'm never going to be able to work with them in Florence. But this is to say that just because something is thought to be done and over and studied doesn't mean it is. And there are barriers in archival research. It's not just the heating and the lighting, it's also gatekeeping of knowledge, especially if you work with private archives. It's not my case, luckily. But private archives, which are technically, again, of the state, they're still held in some of the, what used to be the aristocratic families of Italy, that technically by constitution, we no longer have nobility, but they don't care. So if you want to go and see their archive, you need to address them with the title that they no longer legally have. So they're like, oh, I'm Marquise. Like, you're not a Marquise, I'm a Marquise. So if you want to go and see the archive, you have to call them Marchese, Conte, despite that's not being true. But at least I don't have to deal with those archives. But for example, so the Medici archive is in the state archive because they were the official government, right? But they were not the only important family of Florence of the time. You have the Strozzi or the Pazzi, all of the very important families. They remained private. So the current Strozzi would still have their own archive despite being of the state. It's a public archive, but it is within their premise. So you need to ask for access to their big palaces. It's a great experience, but I did it once and then I said, you know what, I'm not going to work with family archives because I just can't, for principle, because I cannot deal with that. But I'm in a country where there's a lot of, aristocracy, so I guess that I couldn't really work here anyway. But yeah, so that's the experience with the family archives in Florence, in case you're interested in working with them. They have their own historians of their own family, and yes, you need to be well connected just as much as in the Renaissance. Is kind of
Okay. So nothing has changed in 400 years, so that's,
no.
that's good. Fascinating. Now listen, I think we probably finish with a question online. This is by Jude Harris. Was there any evidence of or incidents of unrest or protest, incidents you might expect arising from groups of young and perhaps radical students gathered together in an environment where potentially conventional ideas were being challenged?
Yes, there is a lot of that. There is a lot of quarrels. Sometimes they feel trivial, so sometimes they are fighting for pieces of wood or marble that they were promised and then they gave it to someone else. But Florence, the Academy became its own magistrature, so its own legal body. And since then, so since 1571, in the archives of the Academy, you will find all of the legal issues that happened within the Academy. And most of the times, there were artists themselves that were fighting one another. So if you're interested in the quarreling and the disputes, just look at those. I can tell you which ones they are. I don't know where it is. Where was it? Here. Anyway, I'm happy to share the inventory that I'm not supposed to share with you, this one. So if, so you can see the years here. And so what you do, you basically go in the volume. And sometimes you're lucky and there's an index that tells you a little bit of the main topics, of the main disputes. And sometimes you just have to leaf through a volume of 600, 700 folios. But yeah, there is a lot. If you're interested in sort of the inamity and the quarrels, that would be after 1571. That's the most, the concentration of documents.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, for anybody who wants to delve deeper, I'm sure Carlotta will share her index so you can look at the intrigue yourself. But I'm sure you'll all agree that this has been the most fascinating talk, giving real different insights into the Renaissance academies and their archives. So please put your hands together for Carlotta.